In 1770, British sailors worked their way up Australia's eastern coast and struggled to describe the land. They call it wild, empty country. They are wrong. They are sailing past a human-made garden. James Cook and the botanist Joseph Banks keep reaching for the same comparison. The country looks deliberately tended, almost landscaped. Open meadows. Great shade trees spaced like someone planted them for the view. Lawns running down to the sea. Paths of open grass winding through country rich with animals. It looks, they write, like a gentleman's park in England. One of the largest gardens on earth, in fact, kept open and green and full of game for thousands of years by human hands. And the tool that shaped it is one you have smelled 100 times. We tend to tell the story of humans changing the planet as a fairly recent thing. Farming, 10,000 years ago, then cities, then factories, engines, smokestacks. And underneath that story sits a comforting assumption that before all of it, our ancestors were just passing through. Small bands of hunter-gatherers who took what nature offered, left a few footprints and moved on, leaving the world essentially as they found it, pristine, untouched. But that picture is quietly falling apart, because long before anyone planted a seed or raised a wall, humans had already picked up a tool powerful enough to rewrite entire landscapes. Not an axe, not a plow, fire. And the question of when we first used it, not just to keep warm, but to deliberately reshape the living world around us, turns out to be one of the most surprising in all of human history. Now, controlling fire itself is astonishingly ancient. Deep in Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, a team led by the geoarchaeologist Francesco Berna, then of Boston University, found burned bone and ashed plant matter sitting undisturbed in sediments around 1 million years old. Some of the earliest solid evidence anywhere that a human ancestor, probably Homo erectus, was making fire inside a cave. Push forward to a site called Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, on the bank of the Jordan River, and the archaeologist Naama Goren Inbar of the Hebrew University uncovered the charred remains of seeds, wood, and fish, clustered in what looked like the spots of ancient hearths, roughly 790,000 years ago. So we have been cooking food and huddling around flames for the better part of 1 million years. But here is the thing. Warming your hands is not the same as terraforming a continent. Keeping a fire is one skill. Aiming it at the whole landscape is another thing entirely. So when did we start aiming it? For the earliest clear answer, go to the northern shore of Lake Malawi, in southeastern Africa. In 2021, an anthropologist named Jessica Thompson, then at Yale University, published a study in the journal Science Advances that stitched together something remarkable. Her team combined dense scatters of stone tools, some dating back as far as 92,000 years, with a paleo-environmental record read straight out of the lake's own mud. Layer after layer of pollen and charcoal, stretching back more than 500,000 years. And around 85,000 years ago, the pattern breaks. Charcoal spikes hard. The forest species start vanishing from the pollen, and in their place spreads a sprawling, open bushland. One that, astonishingly, is still sitting there today. Thompson's conclusion was blunt. This was the earliest evidence she had ever seen of humans fundamentally transforming their ecosystem with fire. Not a random wildfire, not a lightning strike. People, burning the land so relentlessly that the forest simply could not grow back. And that behavior, burning to keep the land the way you want it, has a name. Fly back to Australia, to the parkland that fooled Captain Cook. In 1969, an archaeologist named Rhys Jones, working at the Australian National University, coined a term for what Aboriginal people had been doing across that continent for tens of thousands of years. He called it fire stick farming. The idea is deceptively simple. You do not plant crops. Instead, you burn the bush in small, cool, patchy fires, on a careful rotation, section by section, year after year. The burnt patches sprout fresh green shoots that pull in kangaroos and other game, so you always know where the hunting will be good. The mosaic of burnt and unburnt ground stops dead fuel from piling up, which heads off the catastrophic, everything-killing megafires before they can start. You are not farming plants, you are farming the entire landscape. The grass, the animals, and the fire itself. Just how far this went is the life's work of the Australian historian Bill Gammage. In 2011, he published a book with a title that says almost everything. the biggest estate on Earth. Gamage spent over a decade poring over the diaries, paintings, and survey maps of the earliest colonists, and what he pieced together was staggering. Those park-like landscapes were not a lucky accident of nature. Across the whole continent, Aboriginal people had used fire, deep plant knowledge, and the flow of water to engineer a vast, deliberate mosaic. Open grassland here for grazing animals, thick cover there, food plants arranged so a person could travel and eat right across the seasons. It was continent-scale management, run without fences, without plows, without a single domesticated crop. And here is the detail that should genuinely stop you. When that burning stopped, after colonization drove people off their land, the dead fuel began to build. The neat mosaic grew wild and tangled and thick, and the country became a tinderbox. Many of the monstrous bushfires Australia suffers today are, in part, the sound of a garden left untended. Now the picture gets richer, because this is not just an Australian story, or an African one. It is a human one, and it shows up on nearly every continent once you know the ash signature to look for. Take Europe. Long before farming ever arrived there, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were already working the woods with fire. Studies of pollen and charcoal buried in bogs and old lake beds across Britain and northern Europe show that, starting around 9,000 years ago, people were repeatedly burning patches of forest, and one plant kept surging back into the cleared ground. Hazel. The burnt openings filled with hazel and other useful shrubs, which threw off hazelnuts, a rich, fatty, storable food, and drew deer in to browse the fresh regrowth. The fires were set often enough to hold the woodland in that productive, shrubby stage, instead of letting it close back over into dark, foodless high forest. They were gardening the woods without ever planting a thing. Cross the Atlantic, and the same hidden hand appears again. When Europeans reached North America, they too described endless open woodlands you could ride a horse through, and vast grassy plains alive with game. And they too assumed they were looking at raw, untouched nature. It was nothing of the kind. The ethnoecologist M. Kat Anderson, in her landmark 2005 book Tending the Wild, documented how native Californians had deliberately burned their landscapes for thousands of years, to clear brush, to encourage the plants they ate and wove, to keep the oaks healthy and dropping acorns, to hold the whole country open in a rich, deliberate patchwork. And all across the continent, from the tallgrass prairies to the oak and chestnut woodlands of the east, regular human fire shaped which plants grew and which animals thrived. Once again, the proof came from its absence. When the burning was stopped and the people forced off the land, the prairies were swallowed by encroaching trees, and the open, park-like forests choked up with dense undergrowth. The wilderness the colonists thought they had discovered was, in many places, a wilderness they created by ending the gardening. And nowhere is this written more sharply than in New Zealand, because there it happened fast enough to date almost to the decade. When Polynesian voyagers, the ancestors of the Maori, first arrived, around the year 1280, the islands were blanketed in ancient forest. In 2010, a team led by David McWethy published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, reading the charcoal records straight out of lake sediments, and the signal is violent. Within roughly 200 years of people setting foot on the South Island, and at some sites within mere decades, nearly 40% of the forest was gone, burned away, and replaced by open shrubland and fern. An area of ancient woodland the size of a small country, transformed in a handful of human lifetimes. Some of the burning was to flush out the giant flightless moa birds, some to open paths and clear the land. But the lesson is impossible to miss. Give humans fire and a few short centuries, and we can remake an entire country. So here is the reframe that flips this whole story over. We carry a deep, comforting idea about pristine wilderness, untouched nature, the way the world looked before people got involved and started meddling with it. National parks are built on that idea. Whole conservation movements are built on it. But the deeper you dig into the ash, the more that idea dissolves in your hands. Because an enormous amount of what we have called untouched wilderness was nothing of the sort. It was a garden. It was shaped and burned and tended and kept, sometimes for tens of thousands of years, by people who left behind no temples and no crops, only the living shape of the land itself. And in a dark irony, many of those landscapes only began to look truly wild, overgrown and tangled and primed to explode, after the gardeners were pushed off them. That is not the absence of human influence. That is the ghost of it. Now, I have to be honest about where this argument gets contested, because it genuinely does. Not every scientist accepts the grandest version of the picture. In a 2023 paper in the journal History Australia, for example, researchers pushed back hard on what they called grand unified theories, the sweeping claim that an entire continent was one single, deliberately managed estate. The reality, they argue, is patchier and messier than that. Some landscapes were heavily shaped by human fire, others far less so, and it is easy to overstate just how total the control really was. In eastern North America, likewise, some ecologists argue the amount of pre-colonial burning has been exaggerated. This is a real and live debate, and it deserves an honest hedge. The claim is not that ancient people gardened every square meter of the planet. The claim, which the evidence strongly supports, is that humans were deliberately reshaping whole landscapes with fire, tens of thousands of years before the first farm, and that a great deal of what we call natural scenery is quietly, partly, human-made. Walk the timeline back one more time. 1,000,000 years ago, in a South African cave, a human ancestor is already making fire. Around 85,000 years ago, on the shore of Lake Malawi, people burn the forest so persistently it never returns. The oldest ecosystem we know, that humans built with flame. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal Australians tend a continent-sized garden with the fire stick. 9,000 years ago, European foragers burned the woods to raise hazel. In North America, careful fire keeps the prairies open and the oaks heavy with acorns. And 800 years ago in New Zealand, nearly half a forest vanishes into charcoal within a few generations. Different peoples, different continents, thousands of years apart, the same tool and the same quiet act of will, bending the living world to human need, with a burning stick. So the next time someone tells you about untouched wilderness, the pristine forest, the ancient bush, the empty land just waiting to be discovered, hold that word up to the light, because odds are, somewhere in that landscape, long before you or anyone like you arrived, a human being walked through it, with fire in one hand and a plan in their head. We did not begin changing the planet with the plow, or the engine, or the city. We began with a flame and a stretch of dry grass, further back than farming, further back than writing, so far back that it is woven into the very shape of the world you think of as natural. That smell of wood smoke drifting on the wind, the one that reaches something deep and old in you, is not only the smell of us destroying nature. For most of our story, it was the smell of us tending it. All the research is linked in the description.